Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite scientists, a man named Gregor Mendel. So Gregor Mendel was born in 1822. He lived in what is now the Czech Republic, but really kind of interesting thing about him is that he became a monk. He's also known as the father of genetics. So those two things may not necessarily seem like they go together, because normally when you think of monks, you just think of people either transcribing scripture, basically making copies of it, or just kind of wandering around. Generally, you think of like the vow of silence or something like that. But with Gregor Mendel, this is what he looked like. He was actually responsible for the pea plants at the monastery. So he was one of the gardeners, specifically with these pea plants. But he kind of got a little bored with them, and so he started doing some experiments with them. He made a bunch of observations and then started seeing what he could do. So through his observation of the pea plants, he began to study 7 different traits that seemed to be passed on from parent to offspring, progeny. So at this time, we didn't really know anything about genes. We didn't know how material or information was passed from one generation to the next. There was actually an idea that was very obviously false, but an idea that when you passed on whatever you passed on to your offspring, you could actually pass on all of your knowledge as well. Again, obviously false, because if you had a great painter and they had a kid, the kid still had to go through the process of learning to paint. Didn't just immediately pick up where the dad left off. Okay, but there was that idea at the time. So nobody really knew how the genetic information was passed from one generation to the next. So that's one of the things that Gregor Mendel started studying. So the 7 characteristics that he studied, okay, we've got them all right here. So seed form, whether the seed was round or wrinkled, okay, whether it was green or yellow. So we've got our round shape here, we've got our wrinkled shape here, and then we've got the color, yellow or green. We've also got our flower color, white or violet, the pod form, okay, so whether it looked full or if it was constricted so you could see like the shape of the peas inside of it, whether the pod was green or yellow, the stem placement, so if the flowers came off of the terminal or the end of each stem, okay, like here, or if they came off in the middle of the stem, the axial pods, and then whether the plant was tall or short. And so he figured out, kind of the range that all of this came in and was able to actually differentiate between the differences in each of these 7 traits. Now, what was really lucky about this, and partly this was part of his experimental design, was he only picked characteristics that were basically either or. They were either round or they were wrinkled seeds, peas. Okay, the flowers were either white or they were violet. Okay, so everything had only 2 options. Okay, and he was able to distinguish between them relatively well. Okay, so over time, and yes, this took quite a while because this was several generations, but he was able to control which pea plants mix their DNA to make offspring. And so he developed pure lines of plants. Okay, we'll get into that in a little bit, but this allowed him to control the traits of the offspring. So if, say, he wanted to grow plants that had just purple flowers, he was able to actually figure out how to produce just plants that grew purple flowers generation after generation after generation. Okay, this is the same kind of concept that we see in purebred dogs. Okay, they've been bred for specific traits over and over and over again until eventually you got, maybe you were looking for a really good nose, and you get a beagle. okay, hunting dog, okay, or you were looking for the fastest dogs, and then you get a Whippet or a Greyhound, okay, so basically picked these specific traits and then selected for them over and over and over again. This is known as artificial selection today. So these traits are distinguishing characteristics that are inherited. So in humans, it would be eye color, hair color, skin color, height, various different things that you can use to describe what a person looks like. In the pea plants, we've already discussed the 7 that he was looking at. The pea shape and color, the pod shape and color, the flower color, placement, and the height of the plant. And this, his study basically gave rise to the study of genetics, which is the study of biological inheritance patterns and variation. Okay, so it's looking at not just the genes and what they control, but also how are they passed through the generations. How do you keep a population genetically healthy and not inbred and all of that kind of stuff. So there are a lot of different branches of genetics, population genetics, molecular genetics, genomics. You can use it for pedigree study, a lot of different stuff that you can research with genetics. But Gregor Mendel is actually the first person who showed that traits are inherited and passed on as discrete units. Now, he had no idea what was happening on the molecular level, so all he was working with were things at the physical level. Okay, so he was looking at, color, shape, size, different characteristics that were very easy to see, and then he didn't know anything about the genes. Okay, so this name, the genes, these discrete units, came along later. So he basically came up with the theory, and then later scientists began filling in the details. So many in Mendel's day thought that traits were blended. Okay, so if you had a parent who had blonde hair and a parent who had black hair, and they had a kid, you would get a kid with most likely brown hair. Okay, so a mix between the two. If you had brown eyes and then blue eyes that mixed, you would get a mixture of the two. So it would be somewhere in the middle. Okay, and I mean, we can think about it now and know that that's obviously false. Okay, if you have a blonde-eyed parent and a brown-eyed parent, you can still be born with blue eyes. Okay, it doesn't have to be a mix and generally isn't. Right, there are a couple traits that are more of blended kind of things, but we'll get into those later, I think in the next section or the next chapter. But, and basically, if you think about it, if all traits were blended, then everyone would eventually become uniform. Okay, it would be kind of a push towards pulling everyone to the same set of traits, the midpoint of all of the other traits. Okay, and we have never seen that. So it's obviously not a blending of the traits that happens. So Mendel's data actually revealed patterns of inheritance. So he was able to see or predict what the offspring were going to look like based on the parents that he used. So yes, he did a lot of experiments with pea plants. He made 3 key decisions when developing his experiments. So first he used purebred plants. We've already talked about this a little bit, but basically he did this over generations of plants. So it took him several years just to come up with his purebred plant lines. Okay, and you got to think, he was not the only monk at that monastery, so what if somebody else touched his pea plants? I mean, that would kind of be, an 1800 beatdown or something. I don't know. But basically, he created these purebred plants, and so the offspring always presented the exact same characteristics that the parents had. Okay. He could have done this with multiple different characteristics. Most likely he used, one group of plants and purebred them for a specific characteristic, and then another group of plants and purebred them for another characteristic, and so on and so forth. He also controlled the breeding. So if you know about how plants pollinate, okay, you get the two parts of the flower. You have the male part, the stamen, I believe it is, and then the female part. And so what he would actually do would be he would cut off the pollinating parts of the flower right as they were developing. Okay, so he got basically mature pollen, but it hadn't been released yet. And then he could decide which flowers he wanted to actually pollinate with that pollen. So he could very specifically choose which plants he was making, basically. So he could keep his lines purebred. Okay, and then, as I said earlier, he observed either-or traits. So traits that either had one option or option B. There was no option C, there was no mixing, nothing like that. Okay, an example in humans would be being born with 5 fingers versus being born with 6 fingers. Okay, there's an either-or. It's either going to be 5 or it's going to be 6. Okay, and that is discounting mutations in those genes. Okay, because you can actually be born with fewer, but that is a separate mutation and not necessarily like a gene. Well, it is a gene, but it's mutated. So anyway, okay, so he used pollen to fertilize his selected pea plants. So he was very careful about all of this fertilization. So when we talk about this, if you see P, that stands for the parent generation. So he crossed the parent plants in order to produce the first child generation, so the filial generation, or F1 generation. And then pea plants generally will self-pollinate, so you get the pollen grows in the flower or on top of the flower, and then it pollinates its own plant. Okay, so he interrupted that process by removing the pollen from the plant, and that allowed him to actually choose which ones he wanted to fertilize. So he just, went in there with some scissors and cut off the stamens, okay, the male parts, right as they were finishing developing. And then using a brush of some kind, he actually fertilized the pistil, the female part of the pollen, from a different pea plant. Okay, so he was able to actually do cross-pollination instead of self-pollination. So then he allowed the F1 generation to self-pollinate like they normally would. So the pea generation had one plant with purple flowers and one plant with white flowers. When he crossed them, he found that the F1 generation only had purple flowers. Okay? And then when he allowed the F1 generation to self-pollinate, he saw that in the next generation, the F2 generation, some white flowers showed up again. So most of the plants had purple flowers, but some of them still had white flowers. So if we look at that, this is what that looked like. Okay, so you have your parent generation here cross a purple purebred plant with a white purebred plant. Okay, talking about the flowers, and you produce the F1 generation. Well, the F1 generation only had purple flowers. Okay, so the white was completely wiped out in that generation. And then went ahead and allowed the F1 generation to self-pollinate in order to produce the F2. And now you see a few white flowers reappearing. Okay, so again, most of them are purple, but the white flowers are now back. Okay, and we're actually almost out of time, so we're going to stop there for this video and pick up with his conclusions in the next video.